I remember the days before everything fell apart as if they belonged to another lifetime. Susan and I had been married for 6 years, and from the outside, our relationship seemed nearly flawless. We both invested time and love into building our home, and when we decided to start a family, it felt like the last puzzle piece was falling into place. Although our relationship had its difficulties, like my job, which often kept me away for weeks, there was a quiet loneliness between us that we never fully acknowledged. Yet, I still believed we were strong enough to overcome anything. When Susan told me she was pregnant, I was overjoyed. The thought of becoming a father reignited my sense of purpose, and I fully immersed myself in preparing for the baby. We spent hours picking out names, painting the nursery, and planning our future. I even began working closer to home to be more available for her and the baby. For months, everything seemed to be going wonderfully, but I would soon learn that, beneath the surface, things were already starting to unravel. The scene was almost idyllic, like something out of a nostalgic family painting. Though it wasn't the kind you'd see on a magazine cover, my mother-in-law stood on one side of the hospital bed, and my own mother on the other, both watching Susan nurse our newborn daughter. Newborns aren't traditionally adorable, but to parents and grandparents they're flawless. As I observed, I couldn't deny that our daughter was beautiful. Her once blotchy red skin had turned a soft pink, and the waxy birth coating had been wiped away. Even her cone-shaped head had rounded, giving her a gentle, angelic appearance. I felt certain she would grow to resemble her mother Susan, my wife of 6 years, whom I had always regarded as the love of my life. Silently, I watched as Susan tended to our child, while both of our mothers offered unnecessary advice. Yet Susan handled everything naturally, likely due to the parenting classes we had attended, which covered nursing and newborn care in great detail. As I stepped back, a nurse and another woman entered the room. "This is Miss Jenkins from administration. She has the paperwork for the birth certificate," the nurse, whose name I couldn't remember, told us. In any other setting, a woman nursing a baby without a shirt while others handled official documents might seem strange, but here it was routine. "Take your time finishing with your baby," Miss Jenkins said to Susan, "and when you're ready, just fill in the highlighted sections. Most of the information we need is likely already in your hospital records, like your birth date and place of birth, but we'll also need your full names, your maiden name, ages, and a few other details. We'll handle the rest and send it to the parish courthouse. You'll receive a copy of the birth certificate in the mail in a few weeks." With that, Miss Jenkins left. "Honey, why don't you fill in the details?" "I'm a little busy right now," Susan said with a smile. I didn't return the smile. No, I think I'll leave it for you to do later when you're not tied up with the baby," I responded. "Besides, we should probably wait for the DNA test results to confirm whether I'm actually the father. If this were a movie, you'd hear the sound of a record needle screeching to a halt. Everything stopped. 3 of the 4 women stared at me in disbelief. The 4th, the baby, was the only one who didn't. But she was the only one making noise as her feeding was interrupted. Her cry barely masked the collective gasps. My mother-in-law spoke first. "Are you out of your mind? Why would you even suggest?" "Something like that," she demanded, looking at Susan, whose expression shifted from shock to confusion, then to anger. "How dare you accuse me of having someone else's baby?" "What kind of woman do you think I am?" Susan retorted. She paused, then forced a weak smile. "Oh, I get it. It's April Fool's and you're playing a joke on us. Well, it's not funny at all." "You should know better." Her body language betrayed her shock. I stood there, watching her. "I'm completely serious," I replied, my voice icy. "There's a real possibility I'm not the father. How could you even think I'd cheat on you? Have I ever given you any reason to suspect me? Name one time I've made you think I'm seeing someone else," she demanded. Ignoring her question, I continued, "So you're sticking with your usual strategy, deny, and you're doing it convincingly. I have to say, I'm impressed." Turning to my mother-in-law, I added, "Maybe I should move the car seat from my car to yours so you can take Susan and the baby home today. It would be helpful if you could stay with her for a while. Even though you and Mum have offered before, we insisted we could manage. But now she could really use the support since I won't be around." As I turned to leave the room, my mother's firm voice stopped me in my tracks. "Stop right there, Jason Louis Funno," she commanded. I turned slowly, bracing myself. My mother and mother-in-law exchanged worried looks as Susan broke into uncontrollable sobs. "No, you can't. Leave me and little Connie. She's our baby, you're her daddy," Susan cried. Turning to face my mother, I said to Susan. "I know I'm supposed to be her daddy, but am I really her father?" "There's a difference." My mom jabbed me in the chest, snapping me to attention. She stepped closer, grabbed my shirt, and pulled me toward her, locking eyes with me like she did when I was a child. "What's wrong with you, Jason? Why this sudden foolishness you can't back out of?" "Fatherhood, now it's already done. You were ecstatic when Susan told us she was pregnant. You've been reading baby books, buying and putting together the crib, changing table, and everything for the nursery. You even painted it pink and yellow with adorable little animals. Every week you bring home a new toy, some of which she won't use until she can walk." Mom paused, giving me a sharp look. "So what's behind this sudden change of heart?" she asked. "I've had a bit of an awakening," I admitted. "I'm not as enthusiastic about all this anymore, and I'm sure you've noticed." "Hey, Tony," my mother-in-law interjected. "We've all noticed. You haven't held Connie or even really looked at her. We thought maybe it was just the reality of being a dad setting in. What's going on?" "If that baby is mine, I'll do everything to take care of her and be the best dad possible," I said with such intensity that both my mother and Tony stepped back. I was fully committed, but that changed last week when I discovered I might not be the father. I'm not going to bond with a child I won't be raising. What came the unified outcry from three voices. "I'll provide for her if she's mine," I stated firmly, "but if not, Clive Adams can take responsibility for his own child." At the mention of his name, Susan suddenly cried out, "Clive and I never did anything. We've never been physically involved. How can you accuse me of that?" As I moved toward the foot of her bed, Mom and Tony exchanged glances, their eyes bouncing between Susan and me. "Really? You're still going to deny you had an affair for almost 6 months and ended it only 7 months ago after discovering you were pregnant? From what I've heard, he told you to make sure I never found out." Susan's face turned bright red. "No, we absolutely did not. Whoever says otherwise is lying. Who even is Clive Adams, and who told you about this so-called affair?" Tony demanded, her voice rising in frustration. "I want to know who's spreading lies about my daughter." Ignoring her first question, I answered the second. "Clive Adams himself," I said quietly. Before Tony could respond, and perhaps out of exhaustion or distress, Susan blurted, "Clive would never tell you that. He promised." Tony looked between her daughter and me, quickly realizing Susan's slip-up. "I need to know exactly what you know," she said firmly. I paused, and then addressed Susan. "Clive told me everything. He spilled it all. To be fair, he was under a lot of pressure at the time, and he let it all out in the middle of his shouting." "That's ridiculous," Susan replied, her voice trembling. "Clive was just fine when he called me yesterday to check on me and the baby." Her exhaustion was evident, and she may not have realized the mistake she made, but her words hit all of us hard. Tony slumped slightly, and I glanced at my mum, whose eyes were wide with shock as she absorbed everything. "So, you're still in touch with your old flame?" I asked coldly. "Did he offer more advice on how to keep me in the dark about him possibly being the father?" Susan broke down, sobbing so intensely that 2 nurses rushed into the room. "We were so careful. There's no way you could have known. No one knew," Susan sobbed. "She's just a little overwhelmed," I explained to the first nurse, who shot me a protective glare on behalf of her patient. Perhaps my tone had seemed off to her. "We were just discussing which father's name to put on the birth certificate application," I added. The nurse looked at me with suspicion, but it seemed like she started to understand. She turned her attention back to comforting Susan. "Miss Fontenot, let's take some deep breaths and calm down. Remember your breathing techniques from labor. Cheryl will get something to help you relax if necessary, but let's try natural methods first. We don't want anything transferring into your milk, right? Now, inhale with me, deeply." As I watched the nurse soothe Susan, I didn't notice my mum and mother-in-law approaching. "You need to explain what's going on," my mum whispered sharply. I was startled. Mum rarely spoke to me this way, but today it was the second time. Clearly something major was happening. My mother-in-law added, "I want to know the whole story, what, when, and how. This is completely unexpected." "It should be obvious," I replied, glaring at both women. "I'm annoyed that I'm the target of your anger and not Susan. She was seeing a co-worker while she was pregnant, at least one other man besides me. I can't say for sure if there were more." Susan, surprisingly, pulled herself together quickly, considering she had seemed on the verge of a breakdown just moments earlier. "We were so careful," she murmured, desperation in her voice. How? I saw the same questioning look in my mum and Tony's eyes. They were eager to know more. Yes, you were very discreet. I had no idea. Neither did anyone else, I admitted. But Clive, being the smooth talker he is, couldn't resist bragging. He had to show off his conquests, including his most recent one. He couldn't help himself. You know Cheryl Watkins, right? I asked, and Susan nodded. Cheryl had been her co-worker for years, and both she and her husband Steve were part of our social circle. Well, Clive almost convinced Cheryl to meet him at a hotel. Her biggest fear was that he'd talk, and her husband would find out. She wasn't sure she could trust him to keep quiet. So to prove he could be trusted, Clive spilled the details of his past affairs, or whatever you want to call them, conquests, flings, girlfriends. He dropped a few names and gave enough specifics to make her believe him. He even asked her if she could guess who else he'd been involved with, leaving out his public girlfriends, of course, and focusing on married women or co-workers from the office. Cheryl couldn't guess, so to further prove his point, Clive mentioned some women from work. She knew the one before you was Sandy, who backed out after a few months when her husband grew suspicious. Then it was you for 6 months, but you called it off when you found out you were pregnant. Clive told Cheryl that you were hoping your husband was the father, but he wasn't willing to continue the affair. He made sure Cheryl understood just how important it was that your husband, meaning me, never found out. Because he feared I might leave you and not want to deal with child support. During that time you were very open about your pregnancy, excitedly sharing the news with everyone at work. Despite your happiness, I noticed that you didn't show any concern about who the father might be. It seemed like you assumed I wouldn't question it, and even if I did, I'd stay committed and ignore any doubts. But that's not something I was willing to overlook. I paused, allowing my words to sink in. Susan remained silent, her face betraying the emotions she struggled to hide. Tony and Mum listened closely, absorbing every word. They wanted answers as much as I did. It turns out that Lana Richard was Clive's next affair. Her husband grew suspicious when she suddenly began working late, so she had to be more careful. She even ended up late picking up their youngest from daycare a few times. With that disruption in his bed life, Clive turned his attention to Cheryl and succeeded again. As I mentioned, he's smooth, always knowing what to say to win them over. Apparently he's also skilled in bed, keeping his married partners satisfied and coming back for months. Tony and Mom exchanged looks, then turned to Susan. And how exactly did Cheryl end up confessing? Mom asked, trying to make sense of it all. It wasn't intentional, I explained. Apparently Cheryl's quite vocal during intimacy, I added, making Tony wince. She accidentally called out Clive's name in the heat of the moment. Her husband, Steve, pushed her about it, and she confessed. I chuckled, recalling the story Steve shared over a beer. Cheryl wasn't one for primal noises like Susan. She preferred to say exactly what she wanted during intimate moments, according to Steve. One night she shouted, "Give it to me, Clive." I love it. Steve sounds nothing like Clive, and of course Steve knew Clive's reputation as a womanizer. He put the pieces together and confronted Cheryl. That's how he explained it to me. Mom and Tony were visibly shocked by the details, their faces betraying their reactions. When Larry, Lana's husband, found out, he was furious. As you know, Larry is a police officer, which adds another layer of complexity. He kept quiet for a week, waiting for the baby to arrive before taking any action. We didn't want to add any more stress to Susan in her final stages of pregnancy, but now that the baby is here, it's time to be honest about what Clive has done and the fallout that follows. Tony's face went pale, her disbelief obvious. So you're telling me this Clive Adams was involved with several women, including my daughter, and there's a chance Connie is his, she asked, her voice shaking with both anger and disappointment. Yes, I replied bluntly. And Clive has no idea, or maybe he does and just doesn't care about the damage he's caused. A heavy silence filled the room for a moment before my mum finally spoke up. So, what's the next step? I sighed, feeling the weight of my decision. I've already submitted a DNA test. I spoke with the head nurse the day after the baby was born. Since Susan and I are married, I didn't need her consent to test the baby. I opted for an expedited test, and it should take 2 to 3 days to get the results. Tony hesitantly asked, "Do you think you could find it in your heart to forgive Susan and move forward, even if you're not the biological father?" I noticed she referred to the child as the baby, rather than using her name, a small but noticeable shift from her usual speech. Tony was perceptive and could read me well, but it was clear she still held on to some hope. I glanced at my mum, who had already figured out how I felt. Although she understood, she wasn't happy about it. To be honest, I'm not sure I can move past this, even if I am the father, I admitted. I've had just over a week to process it, and this wasn't a one-time mistake, like a drunken fling. It was a 6-month affair. I can't trust her anymore. She didn't just disrespect me. In our marriage, she risked getting pregnant by someone else while we were actively trying for a child. She told her whole family that we had decided to conceive. Yet her continued affair with Clive shows me she didn't care who the father was. Have you considered couples therapy? My mum interjected, possibly trying to cut off any arguments from Susan's family. And remember, the baby isn't at fault. That little girl will still need a father, even if you're not her biological dad. You could still be her daddy. I sighed again. Like I said earlier, Mum, I doubt therapy will help. What I really want to understand is where I went wrong as a husband. There must have been something I did or didn't do that led Susan to betray me. It's not like she was trying to replace me. Clive is a known womanizer. He'd never commit to her. And I'm sure she knew that. I shook my head, feeling frustration bubbling up. I'm trying not to say the harsh things on my mind. Neither of them deserves my anger right now, but I'm on edge and close to snapping. Aside from physical attraction, or maybe the thrill, I can't see any other reason for this. I thought our relationship was strong. Both women remained silent as I continued. You can imagine how devastated I've been since I found out. Just like you said, Mum, I was so excited to be a dad. Then, suddenly, everything fell apart. My whole world collapsed. Honestly, at this point, I almost hope I'm not the father. Both women looked surprised by my admission. That way, I wouldn't have to deal with being a part-time dad. Honestly, I don't know if I can handle interacting with Susan, even if the baby is mine. That's going to take a lot of therapy. At that moment, the nurse stepped out of the room and said, "Mr. Fontenot, your wife wants to speak with you. She knows you're still here, otherwise her mother would have come back by now." Her tone carried some sympathy for what I was going through, or at least it seemed that way. But before I could head back in, she stopped me. "If you do go in, I hope you can remain calm. I understand you're upset, but we'd prefer not to upset her further. We want to avoid giving her sedatives if possible, as she's scheduled for discharge this afternoon, and it wouldn't be ideal to give her extra medication that could transfer to the baby through her milk. From your childbirth classes, you know how important colostrum and early breast milk are for the baby's immune system." I nodded, realizing she was appealing to my concern for the baby's health, no matter whose child it was. "Maybe you should talk to her," Mum suggested gently. "Tony and I can grab some coffee. Hand over your car keys and we'll move the car seat. I'll wait for you to finish. And before you go, swing by the nursery and take a good look at Connie. I think she looks a lot like you when you were born." "Wishful thinking, Mum? Or are you just seeing what you want to see?" I asked. She shrugged, clearly unhappy with the situation. I knew if I turned out to be the father, she would be deeply involved in raising the baby, no matter what happened between Susan and me. Mum was already committed to her role as a grandmother, just as I had been preparing for fatherhood. It was clear she hadn't fully accepted the possibility that the baby might not be her grandchild. I entered the room, and as soon as Susan saw me, she started crying again. "You must hate me," she sobbed. "No, I don't hate you. That's the issue," I said, trying to remain calm. "I hate what you did, and I'm so angry I can hardly think straight. Deep down, I wanted to shake her and walk out. If there wasn't a chance the baby was mine, I would have left already. But I needed answers. "Do you really want to talk now, or would you prefer a few more days to figure out how to explain this?" I asked, my voice sharp. "I don't need more time," Susan began, but I cut her off, though I was desperate for answers. "You've had 9 months to think about what to say if I ever found out you were cheating with Clive Adams, of all people." My voice trembled as I spoke his name. "Clive Adams," I repeated, taking a few deep breaths. "No, I didn't think he could be the father. That was you. I thought I was having our baby, not his." Susan defended herself. "Our baby? I might be the father, but that's doubtful," I shot back. To her credit, she looked genuinely surprised. "Come on. I was still offshore, working on a rig during the first week of July when you supposedly got pregnant, most of that week anyway. I double-checked my work schedules. I remember coming home at the end of that week, and we made up for lost time. We were intimate right away. Just like we always were, or how we used to be. I thought that's when you got pregnant. That's what I told the guys at work. I had no idea Clive was in the picture. As soon as Susan started to protest, I interrupted again. "What about the weeks before that?" Right up until I got off the helicopter. Did you have him over while I was away? Did you move him in? Did you sleep with him in our bed? I kept pressing, letting the questions spill out. Not that it matters where, it's the fact that you did it. No, Susan shouted. He never came to the house, except for those few times we hosted barbecues and invited people from work. We were careful. We wouldn't risk a neighbor seeing him or his car parked at the house. But not careful enough to avoid getting pregnant, so don't say a condom broke, I said coldly. Clive seems like the type to take risks or at least push boundaries as long as he benefits. I got tested for STDs this past week. I suggest you get tested too, I added. Susan muttered softly. That was part of my early pregnancy exams. I was a little surprised since I didn't think that was standard. I told my doctor I wanted to make sure you hadn't caught something while you were away for work, she admitted, sounding ashamed. My face flushed with anger. So, your obgyn thinks I might have been the one cheating, and instead of telling the truth, you let her believe that I had more questions, and I needed answers. Why did you cheat? Why with him? Why would you risk getting pregnant by Clive? Why not just go back on birth control and pretend you wanted to wait longer to have a baby so you could sleep with him without the risk? Susan looked down. I don't know. I was lonely. You were gone a lot. I was attracted to him and Clive was there. We started talking, and before I knew it, we were already close. I knew he wasn't looking for anything serious. She hesitated, struggling with the next part. As for why I didn't go back on birth control, I was already seeing Clive before we decided I'd stop taking it. He refuses to use condoms. I'd take a shower afterward to lower the risk a little. I know it wasn't the safest option, but I thought it was the best choice. I muttered sarcastically. Keeping your legs closed would have been a better option. Susan looked shocked, and I hoped she wouldn't shut down before I got more answers. So you cheated on me for about 4 months before getting pregnant and then continued for another 2 months? I asked, trying to move the conversation forward. Susan nodded. I suspected I might be pregnant, but I didn't want to stop until I was sure. I justified it by thinking if I was already pregnant, it didn't matter if I kept seeing him. She winced at her own words. Clive ended it after I told him about the baby, she admitted. He didn't want to risk you finding out and having to take responsibility if the baby was his. So you two discussed your options, I asked? Yes, we both thought you'd never suspect Connie wasn't yours, she said quietly. And there was a good chance she wasn't his, especially since you came home that first week in July. We were together the whole time and I didn't see Clive at all while you were home, she added. So you had an affair with Clive while I was away, working to support us and the life we wanted, I said, piecing it together. Was it out of resentment because I wasn't around, or I almost asked the harsher question but held back? Susan quickly shook her head, trying to dismiss the implications. No, it wasn't like that, she insisted. It was purely physical. I felt desire when you were away. Clive and I only got together when you were out of town. We met at his place 3 or 4 times a week, but we were cautious. I didn't stay overnight every time. And I tried to make it seem like I was mostly at home. We never showed anything at work that would make people think we were more than co-workers. Her words seemed practiced, as though she had been justifying the affair to herself for a long time. And no, he's not better endowed, and he's not better in bed, she added, picking up on my unspoken thoughts. We didn't do anything that you and I don't do. He was just there when you weren't, and it was exciting. That's the best way to describe it. And no, I didn't do it to get back at you, I did it for myself. Her honesty cut deep. It felt as though she had rationalized the affair as something she deserved. I clenched my jaw. If you were only mine when I was around, then you were never really mine, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You were my wife, but you were his mistress. You were so careful not to get caught, but then you got pregnant, I added bitterly. I guess you never thought about what would happen if I found out later that our first child wasn't mine, maybe because of a blood type difference, or if she didn't look like our other kids. That's assuming you don't cheat again and let another man father your next child, or go back to Clive for another one. Susan shook her head frantically. No, I promised I wouldn't cheat again. I knew that once you bonded with Connie, you'd never leave her, even if she wasn't yours. Just look at how dedicated you already are to her. You've been a devoted father to that baby, even Clive agrees. A few points for me, huh? I said sarcastically. So you and Clive have been talking about whether he's the father? You said he called yesterday to check on you. It's obvious you two have discussed how to manage me, how to keep me in the dark, and plan for my reaction. Susan started to fidget, clearly uncomfortable. And the key word was as in I was invested in being that baby's dad, I said coldly. Both moms have noticed I haven't held her once, haven't changed her diaper, haven't swaddled her, or even taken more than a passing glance at her from a distance. I'll change that if the DNA test shows I'm her father. I locked eyes with her. Let me ask you something, did it ever really matter to you whether I was the father or Clive? Susan didn't deny it. Of course I wanted you to be the father, she admitted. But once I found out I was pregnant, I just wanted the baby. I knew she'd be beautiful, and I didn't think you'd question anything. You and Clive don't look that different, you've got the same hair color, a similar build. You'd be her dad, and it wouldn't matter. I felt bitterness rise in me. I've been cutting back on my time offshore. I gave up those big bonuses, started spending more time at the office. I even took a pay cut. You seemed happy I was home more, at least that's what I thought. If my being away was such a problem. You should have said something a long time ago. All you had to do was ask. Everything I did was for you. Susan began crying again, but this time it didn't move me. Well, that's all going to change. If I'm not the father, I'm going back to the rigs. I'll stay out there until I find a woman who actually wants to be with me and only me, not someone who can't stay faithful when I'm away. My voice was sharp with anger. Her tears kept flowing, but they barely registered with me. But I need you to help take care of the baby, she sobbed. We're a family. What about us? We've done so well these past 7 months. I've been a good wife, I haven't looked at another man since then. We could try counseling. Right now, I'm not sure there's still a US, I said coldly. We'll figure things out if the DNA test shows I'm the father. But for now, I'm not staying here. Not until I get those results. I've already packed up what's important to me. Her face reflected pure shock as she stared at me in disbelief. Where will you go? She asked softly, her voice shaking with fear. I've rented an apartment, I replied coldly. I arranged it last week. I wanted to wait until the baby was born before leaving. Tony will stay with you for now, and maybe my mum will help too. She's hoping Connie's her grandchild. With that, I turned and left the room. Susan's sobs continued, though less intensely than before. On my way out, I nearly ran into Tony and my mum, who had clearly been eavesdropping outside the door. Yeah, I heard you, Sue, Tony said bitterly. But don't lose hope. There's still a chance for reconciliation, especially if Connie is your daughter, she added, ever the optimist. I turned to her, my voice sharp. Really, you claim you were listening, but did you miss the key points? Like the fact that she never once apologized for cheating? She feels no guilt. She just justified it by saying she was lonely and aroused, as if that excuses anything. She didn't even care whether I'm the father or not. She just expects me to deal with it and accept everything that's disgusting. Tony looked shocked by my intensity, her eyes filling with tears. Mom stepped in, trying to calm the situation. We moved the car seat and got it secured, she said softly. I'm going to pack a bag and stay with you both for a few days. Even if you're not the father, Sue has been like a daughter to me for the last 6 years. I can't just abandon her, not yet, at least. But don't get me wrong. I don't approve of what she did. I'm angry too. If she hadn't just had a baby, I think Tony and I would both have told her how foolish she's been. I nodded, appreciating her honesty. When they asked, I shared the address of my new apartment, though I didn't mention that I had already consulted a lawyer and taken steps to protect my share of the assets. I had paid off our credit card debts and safeguarded our investment accounts. I had even instructed the lawyer to prepare divorce papers on the grounds of infidelity, though it wasn't recognized in our state. While Susan would be home for a few days, I didn't want to risk her accessing our finances online, so I took precautions. I was almost certain our marriage was beyond saving. Any lingering doubt I had, based on the happiness we once shared, had evaporated. Trusting her again seemed impossible. On my way to my new apartment, I called Steve, needing someone to share a drink with. I had planned to take a few weeks off work after the baby was born to help my wife adjust a kind of male version of maternity leave. But at that moment, I didn't want to be alone. Steve, with his flexible schedule, agreed to meet me at the bar. He worked for his father-in-law's company and hinted that he might not be there much longer, especially after Cheryl's confession. You talked to Susan? I take it Steve asked. I nodded and shared the details of our conversation. I've consulted the same lawyer you did. Luckily, Cheryl's father made us sign a prenuptial agreement before the wedding. He wanted to protect his business. Cheryl has some stock, but she doesn't get dividends or have any influence. She'll keep the stock, but I'll end up with almost everything else. Steve and I had discussed this before, and he knew Susan would be entitled to half of our shared assets, which was a significant sum. Both of us had contributed financially to the marriage, with Susan earning a decent salary. I was hoping to stir things up enough to avoid paying alimony, and I thought Tony might help with that. As for child support, it only mattered if the baby was mine, which I still doubted. I'm going to pay for this, I grumbled. The courts will punish me, even though I didn't do anything wrong. Steve nodded. Larry and I went to see Don Ducat. His wife also had an affair with Clive. As you can imagine, Don was furious. Larry, being a cop, warned him not to do anything reckless. I nodded. Don was angry with us too. He couldn't believe we were just going to let Clive walk away after making fools of us. He called us weak for not confronting Clive immediately. Larry surprised me when he said, "Who said anything about letting that fool off easy?" He told Don not to do anything stupid, nothing that would get him caught. Clive isn't worth going to jail over just because he acted impulsively, he said. Don may be quick-tempered, but he's not stupid. Steve added. Don said, "I just need to make sure I don't get caught when someone deals with Clive." We laughed it off, and he eventually calmed down enough to listen. I chuckled darkly. Yeah, we know something has to be done about Clive, but it has to be handled carefully. Castrating him isn't the answer. Steve gave me a puzzled look. "You've lost it," he said. "Even if you did that, he'd still have financial responsibilities. He's responsible for wrecking marriages, yours, mine, and probably Don's. Larry might stay with Lana for now because of the kids. But it depends on how she reacts when he confronts her tonight. He's been putting it off because of you." "Clive's lies will unravel soon enough," I replied. "These women will warn him. He won't stick around for long. His problem is he's too easy to track. People underestimate how hard it is to truly disappear. You can't make the kind of money Clive wants and stay off the radar. He's in trouble. Trust me, if we already know about 4 women he's been with, there are probably more. It's like shaking a haystack and finding 4 needles. The whole stack must be full of them. We need to track down other husbands who might want to deal with him too." Steve laughed at the comparison. "As for punishing him, I'd prefer to leave him with at least 1 testicle intact and undamaged." Steve looked baffled. "Why only 1?" he asked. "If he loses both, he could take hormone replacements and still have sex. But if you leave him with 1 and damage it, he'll have lasting discomfort. It could stop him from repeating his behavior without doing anything extreme. Plus, it'll mess with his mind." Steve burst into laughter, knowing he'd eventually share my idea with Larry and Don. He had already talked to them and knew they'd find the humor in it. 2 days later, I stopped by the house Susan and I used to share. Tony answered the door. "You didn't waste any time, did you? What do you want?" she asked bitterly. "Susan got the divorce papers this morning," I said, feeling a mix of guilt and relief. "She's been crying non-stop since then. The only time she seems okay is when she's with Connie. I can't blame you. But I thought you'd hold off. She's really hurting. I doubt she'd even consider another relationship after all this. Do you think there's any chance for reconciliation if you both went to counseling?" Tony asked, still clinging to hope. I shook my head. I was already convinced there was no future for us, and this just proves it, I said, handing her the paternity test results. "The baby isn't mine." Tony looked at the envelope, tears rolling down her face. She was devastated. The weight of shattered hopes and dreams was hitting her hard. After a final hug, she turned to deliver the news to her daughter. I had already told my mother, who was heartbroken over the loss of her chance to be a grandmother. Furious about Susan's infidelity, she had chosen to stay home instead of being with Tony and Susan while waiting for the DNA results. My mother, too, was a victim of Susan and Clive's betrayal. The entire town was buzzing with gossip about Clive Adams and his affairs with married women. In the days that followed, Steve, Larry, Don, and I confronted our wives, making no effort to conceal his name. In fact, we made sure to expose his actions, even though none of us liked being labeled as betrayed. We stood firm, sharing how our wives had fallen for his charm. Clive's tactic appeared to involve boasting about his past exploits to Cheryl, and the other women were easily swayed by his smooth talk. Despite their seemingly happy marriages, they were drawn to Clive's allure and enjoyed the excitement he offered. As word of his affairs spread, fathers of babies born to women connected to him began demanding paternity tests. I later heard of 2 more children he had fathered. Suspicious husbands started questioning their wives, and some couples even sought counseling. The full extent of his actions remained hidden until Clive eventually confessed to the police. You'd think that someone living Clive's lifestyle would keep his assets liquid, ready to vanish if needed, but instead of turning his earnings into cash or easily movable assets, Clive chose to buy a house and invest in multiple real estate properties. His home was lavishly decorated, with expensive art hanging alongside the usual hunting and fishing gear typical in our town. His boat was set up for both water skiing and fishing. While the police weren't actively pursuing him at first, even if Clive had managed to convert his assets and flee, private investigators could have tracked him down. It's difficult to truly disappear when your social security number is required for any high-income job. Clive severely underestimated the rage of the husbands. Instead of fleeing the area, he stayed and paid the price. Just a few days after news of his affairs spread, Clive was discovered on the sidewalk near his home, barely conscious and in shock. A passing jogger found him during his morning run and immediately called an ambulance. She couldn't untie the straps that bound his arms behind his back. When she tried to roll him over, Clive screamed in agony, so she wisely stopped, fearing she might make things worse. When the paramedics arrived, they discovered his groin had been smashed with a 3-pound sledgehammer. I heard this detail from Larry the cop while we were at the bar. He shared the story with Steve, Don and me, both cheerfully and seriously, mentioning how 2 detectives jokingly told him that if he ever found a 3-pound hammer with some tissue on it, he should toss it into the swamp. I had nothing to do with what happened to that guy's ... situation, but I'm just passing along what my fellow officers told me, Larry said, with a sly grin and a barely hidden smirk. Clive had no idea who had attacked him. He vaguely remembered hearing his doorbell ring, though whether it was late that night or early that morning, he couldn't recall. It had been dark, and he had been asleep. I think they used a taser, Clive told investigators. They shocked me down there a few times. I remember that. There might have been 2 of them, but I'm not sure. I was pretty out of it. One of them said something about not going after another man's wife, and then it was just ... unbearable pain. Desperate to see his attackers brought to justice, Clive gave investigators the names of every woman he had been involved with over the past few years, married or not. The list was surprisingly long, and with so many leads to follow, the investigation became complicated. Despite numerous suspects, no solid evidence pointed to anyone, and the unclear timing of the attack made alibis hard to verify. In private, Larry confided to Steve and me that the detectives on the case felt Clive had gotten what he deserved. After a few months, the investigation stalled and eventually hit a dead end. As expected, Susan received half of our shared property. The house was sold, and a new family moved in, bringing their young daughter into the nursery I had carefully painted with little animal designs. I hoped the new family appreciated the effort I had put into it. Susan moved back to her mother's house since she was struggling to care for the baby alone. At least with Tony, she wouldn't be completely lonely. As for me, I had lost any interest in her romantic life. Susan called me once to apologize, likely under pressure from Tony. However, she didn't specify what she was apologizing for, whether it was for the affair, getting pregnant by another man, or for my finding out and divorcing her. I didn't ask. By that time I had already moved on. When she suggested meeting to talk, I declined. She also asked if I knew what had happened to Clive and whether I was involved. I simply told her he got what he deserved and ended the call. After that, we never spoke again, handling everything through our lawyers. I often wondered how much time and money Susan would spend trying to force Clive to pay child support, knowing he wouldn't do so willingly. She'd eventually get the money, but hiring a lawyer to fight him would drain her savings first. Clive was facing several lawsuits, all of a similar nature, and I heard that steps were being taken to prevent him from selling off his properties. Between his medical bills, legal fees, and looming child support, he wouldn't have much left, assuming he could even keep his job. 18 months later, at 3 a.m., I stood leaning against the lower rail of the Econ 626 rig in the Gulf of Mexico. The crisp autumn breeze felt refreshing, and my light windbreaker kept me warm. It was one of my last routine visits to the rigs. I had met someone and decided she was worth pursuing. We had a great connection, and though I didn't know where it would lead, I was open to what the future held. I was finally ready to accept the job offer at headquarters that I had turned down twice before. As I unzipped my jacket, I felt the familiar weight of the lump hanging over my belt. Its presence confused me, as I had tried many times to part with it, but couldn't bring myself to let it go. Keeping it made no sense, but it brought me an odd sense of comfort, as if I had regained a part of myself. Without further thought, I pulled out the heavy hammer from its hiding spot and threw it into the sea. After that day at the hospital when I walked away from Susan and Connie, everything seemed to slow down. Life felt distant, like I was just a spectator watching it fall apart, unable to intervene. The days blurred together, each one feeling heavier than the last. Work was my only refuge, if you could even call it that. But even the rig, once a place that felt like home, became somewhere I couldn't escape my thoughts. I rented a small apartment not far from where we used to live. It was a cold, impersonal space, like a motel room you stay in for a few nights before moving on. I didn't bother furnishing it much, there wasn't a point. I barely spent any time there. If I wasn't at work, I was at the bar, drowning my sorrows and nursing my wounded pride. It's strange how things can fall apart all at once, like a dam giving way after the smallest crack. Susan and I had been good, hadn't we? Or was that just my version of things? Maybe I had been blind all along, missing the signs because I didn't want to admit the truth that our marriage had started crumbling long before Clive wormed his way in. For weeks after I left, I wrestled with whether to see Connie again. My mother kept asking, "Have you gone to see the baby yet?" as if holding her would magically make everything better, but how could I look at her without wondering if she was truly mine? I had told myself I'd stay away until the DNA results came back, but even after they confirmed what I feared, that I wasn't the father, I couldn't stay away. There was a part of me, twisted as it sounds, that was still drawn to her, to the baby I had prepared for, to the life I had envisioned. In a way, it felt like I was abandoning not just Susan but a piece of myself. I eventually went back, but not for Susan, for Connie. There was no dramatic reunion, no big emotional scene. I walked in and Tony handed me the baby without saying a word. I sat down on the same couch where I had once imagined our family's future. Holding Connie wasn't the release I had hoped for. As I looked down at her tiny face, all I could see was Clive's betrayal and Susan's lies. Connie was innocent in all of it, of course, but that didn't make it any easier. It didn't erase what had happened. Tony's voice cut through my thoughts, pulling me back to reality. "You're not the father," she said quietly but firmly, as if trying to convince herself as much as me. "You don't owe anything." After that day, I walked away without looking back. I made a conscious decision to move on. And by that, I mean I buried myself in work, in anything that kept my mind occupied. I accepted the job at headquarters that I'd been offered months earlier, trading my life offshore for a desk job in the city. The rhythm of office work was different, but no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the echoes of what had happened. But then something unexpected occurred. I met someone new. Her name was Lily, and she was unlike anyone I'd ever known. There was a quiet strength in her, a calmness I hadn't realized I needed until it was there. We met through mutual friends, and what started as casual dinners evolved into something deeper. She never pushed me to talk about Susan, thank God, but she was there when I needed to, even if I could only offer broken fragments of the story. With Lily, things were different. She made me believe in a future again, one where the past didn't have to define me. Slowly, I began to open up, cautiously sharing bits of myself, and she trusted me with her past too, with her own scars. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and after everything that had happened, I realized maybe that was enough. It's been 3 years since I left that hospital room. Susan and I haven't spoken since, except through lawyers. Connie is someone else's responsibility now, and I've learned to accept that. I still think about her sometimes, but less and less as the days go by. As for Clive, he got what was coming to him. I'll admit, there are still nights when I think about the hammer, what it symbolized, why I held onto it for so long. Maybe it was my way of holding onto some semblance of control, reminding myself that even though my world had fallen apart, I wasn't completely powerless, but when I finally let it go, when I threw it into the sea, it felt like a release. A final farewell to the man I used to be. Now, with Lily by my side, I'm learning to be someone new, someone better. The scars are still there, but they no longer define me. I'm not the man who lost everything, I'm the man who chose to rebuild. And for the first time in a long while, that feels like enough.